Step into a world of steel, honor, and unrelenting struggle. This is the story of a knight, born to serve, trained to fight, and tested by war, politics, love, and death. From the harsh winters and blood-soaked battlefields to the whispers of betrayal and the burdens of legacy, follow Sir Aldrich as he navigates the brutal life of a medieval knight. Witness the glory, the heartbreak, and the sacrifices that shaped a man bound by duty, honor, and faith. This is more than a tale of swords and shields. It is a journey through courage, loyalty, and the human spirit in the age of knights. The brutal life of a medieval knight. The wind howled through the narrow windows of the stone manor house, carrying with it the chill of a harsh medieval winter. Inside, the great hall was dimly lit by tallow candles, their smoky flames casting restless shadows on the rough-hewn beams above. The air smelled of straw, smoke, and the pungent tang of the animals kept indoors to survive the cold. On this night, the lord of the manor paced back and forth near the central hearth, his boots striking the rush-covered floor with impatient rhythm. From beyond the heavy wooden door came the muted cries of his wife, laboring in the birthing chamber. The lord's face, rugged and scarred from years of petty wars and border skirmishes, was set with an anxious determination. This child, if it were a boy, would be destined for the life of a knight, a warrior sworn to the defense of his lord, his faith, and his honor. The lineage of this family depended upon it. When the cry of a newborn finally echoed through the house, the lord's tense expression softened into relief. The midwife appeared moments later, face flushed from the heat of the birthing room, and announced the birth of a healthy boy. There was no elaborate celebration. This was not the birth of a prince, but the arrival of a future soldier, a potential heir to a small patch of land and a name that must be carried forward. The lord strode into the room to gaze upon the squirming infant. The child was red-faced, fists clenched, and already crying with surprising strength, a promising sign. A few murmured prayers of thanks were offered to God, and soon a priest from the nearby chapel was summoned to perform the baptism. In an age when infant mortality was cruelly high, a Christian baptism was urgent, for no parent wished to risk the eternal damnation of a soul that had not been sanctified. The baptism was simple but solemn. A small basin of cold water, a whispered Latin blessing, and the child was declared a Christian, marked with the sign of the cross upon his tiny forehead. This ritual was more than a religious act. It symbolized that the boy's life no longer belonged solely to his parents but also to God and, by extension, to the great chain of feudal obligation that ruled medieval society. One day he would swear an oath to a liege lord, binding himself to a code of loyalty that could cost him his life. For now he was swaddled tightly and placed in the care of a wet nurse, for his mother's strength was spent. The manor house soon settled back into its nightly rhythm. The crackle of the hearth, the distant howls of wolves in the forest, the clinking of armored guards changing shifts outside the walls. The boy's early years would be marked by a strange duality of privilege and hardship. As the son of a minor noble, he was spared the back-breaking labor of the serfs who worked the surrounding fields. He would never have to till the soil, bend his back under the lord's grain sacks, or be whipped for failing to deliver the proper tithe. Yet his life was far from comfortable by modern standards. The manor was drafty and cold, heated only by smoky fires that filled the rooms with soot. Food was coarse, often little more than dark bread, salted meat and weak ale. Illness was a constant threat, and even the nobility could not always afford physicians or proper remedies. But this rough upbringing would harden the boy's body and spirit, preparing him for the trials of knighthood that awaited him. From the very beginning, the boy was surrounded by symbols of war. In the main hall, swords and shields hung from the walls, trophies from past conflicts or heirlooms passed down from father to son. The boy would grow up listening to the tales of warriors, his father's exploits in skirmishes with rival lords, the battles of distant kings, and the great crusades that were said to be fought in the Holy Land. The clank of chainmail and the neighing of war horses became the music of his childhood. Knights in service to his father would visit the manor, their presence awe-inspiring to the boy. Their armor gleamed in the firelight, their spurs jingled with every step, and their very bearing seemed to radiate authority. It was clear to all who saw him that one day, if fortune favored him, this child would don the same steel and ride into battle under his lord's banner. But the path to knighthood was not guaranteed. The family's fortunes could turn with alarming speed. A poor harvest might starve the peasants and empty the lord's granaries, leaving little coin for the expensive training and equipment a knight required. War or plague could claim the lives of heirs, throwing inheritance into chaos. Thus, the boy's father took great care to ensure his son's survival and upbringing. By the time the child was old enough to walk, he was already learning discipline. Meals were not simply for eating, they were lessons in manners, in proper posture, in the deference due to guests and elders. The boy was taught his prayers, instructed to kneel before the small wooden crucifix in the hall and recite the Pater Noster each evening. He was also taught to respect the natural order, to understand that God had placed his family above the peasants but below the great lords, and that this hierarchy must be obeyed if the world were to remain in harmony. Childhood games often mimicked the life that awaited him. The boy and other children of the manor would fashion crude wooden swords and shields, striking at one another in mock battles until one fell crying into the mud. These early skirmishes were not mere play but practice, building the reflexes and courage the boy would one day need. Occasionally, a traveling knight or soldier would take notice of the child's spirited nature and offer him a few pointers: how to hold a weapon, how to balance his stance. Each such moment planted the seeds of ambition deeper in his heart. By the age of 7, the boy's fate was sealed. The Lord began to make arrangements for him to be sent away to another noble household as a page, the first formal step on the long road to knighthood. This was a proud but bittersweet moment for the family. The boy's mother wept quietly, for she knew that her son's childhood would soon end. The father, however, was resolute. "Better he learn to serve now," he muttered, "for soon he must learn to fight." The boy, wide-eyed and eager, could not yet understand the hardships that awaited him. All he knew was that knights were heroes, and he wanted nothing more than to become one of them. The morning of his departure was gray and misty. The boy was dressed in a simple tunic, kissed by his mother, and handed a small wooden cross to wear around his neck. Mounted servants waited with the pack horses that would carry his meager belongings to his new home. As the boy looked back at the manor one last time, he felt a strange mix of fear and excitement. He was leaving behind the safety of childhood for a world of strict discipline, hard training, and endless expectations. Ahead lay the first step on the brutal path to knighthood. The boy's journey to his new home took 2 days along muddy country roads, escorted by his father's men. They passed fields where peasants bent low to harvest grain, their backs bowed from a lifetime of toil. Here and there they crossed paths with merchants, pilgrims, and the occasional band of soldiers moving from one lord's service to another. By the second evening, the boy's clothes were spattered with mud, his legs sore from riding. Yet when the distant shape of a stone manor came into view through the mist, his spirits lifted. This was to be his new home, the place where he would begin the long, hard journey toward becoming a knight. The lord of the house greeted them in the courtyard. He was a stern man with graying hair, dressed in a simple but fine tunic, a sword belted at his side. After a few brief words exchanged between the two lords, mostly formalities and thanks, the boy was introduced. The new lord placed a heavy hand on his shoulder, studying him with a gaze that seemed to measure not only his small frame but also his worth. Then, without ceremony, the boy's father mounted his horse and rode away, leaving him standing in the courtyard with his meager belongings and a lump forming in his throat. It was the first true moment of separation from his family, and though his young heart ached, he swallowed his fear. He had no choice but to stay. Life as a page began the very next morning. The boy was roused from bed before dawn by an older servant and told to wash quickly with cold water from a wooden bucket. There was no gentle easing into this new life. Discipline was to be his constant companion. After a simple breakfast of bread and cheese, he was brought before the lady of the house, who would instruct him in manners, etiquette, and the refined behavior expected of a noble. He learned to bow properly, to address his superiors with respect, and to stand silently and still when spoken to. There were lessons in Latin prayers, in reading the Psalms, and in reciting passages of Scripture. Religion was no small part of a page's education, for a knight was not merely a warrior but a defender of Christendom. But the boy's education was not all piety and politeness. Much of his time was spent running errands for the lord and lady of the house. He fetched water, carried messages, cleaned boots, and helped serve meals in the great hall. These tasks taught him obedience and humility, essential virtues for one who would one day command others. There were moments of humiliation as well. A sharp word from the steward if he moved too slowly, a cuff to the ear if he dropped a tray. The boy learned quickly that mistakes were not tolerated and that every duty, no matter how small, must be performed with care. When the day's chores were finished, the boy was permitted to watch the older squires and men-at-arms training in the yard. This was the highlight of his day, for here he glimpsed the life he longed to live. He watched as squires sparred with wooden swords, their practice bouts ending in bruises and bloodied lips. He saw them lift heavy shields and run drills until they collapsed in exhaustion. He watched the knights themselves, armored and imposing, tilt at the quinton, a rotating target used to teach them how to strike while on horseback. Every clash of sword against shield, every shouted command from the master-at-arms, filled the boy with determination. One day he told himself he would stand among them. His training began with the most basic tasks. He was given a wooden practice sword nearly as tall as he was and taught how to hold it correctly. At first his arms ached terribly and his strikes were clumsy. The master-at-arms, a scarred veteran who had fought in countless campaigns, was merciless in his instruction. "Feet apart," he barked. "Keep your guard up." Again. Day after day, the boy was drilled until blisters formed on his hands and his muscles trembled from fatigue. But he did not complain, for to endure hardship without protest was considered the mark of a future knight. Physical training was relentless. The boy was sent to run laps around the manor yard until his lungs burned, to climb the wooden palisade as if scaling a castle wall, to wrestle with other pages in the dirt until one pinned the other to the ground. The purpose was not merely to strengthen the body but to build endurance, resilience, and the instinct to keep fighting even when every muscle screamed in pain. Alongside this he learned to ride, first on a gentle pony and later on a larger horse, until he could stay seated even at a gallop. Falling was inevitable, but each time he was ordered to mount again, no matter how badly he was bruised. In addition to combat and horsemanship, the boy was trained in hunting and falconry. These pursuits were both practical and symbolic. They taught him patience, coordination, and the skills to provide food if ever forced to live off the land during campaign. He learned to track deer through the forest, to set traps for rabbits, and to handle a hawk so that it would return with its catch. These hunts were often the only moments when the boy felt a sense of freedom, galloping through the woods with wind whipping through his hair, the thrill of the chase stirring something wild in his blood. Not all of his lessons were about strength and skill. The lady of the house ensured that he was schooled in courtly manners and the art of conversation. He learned to play simple tunes on the lute, to compose verses of poetry, and to dance, skills that might one day charm a lady or please a lord. The contrast between the brutality of the training yard and the refinement of the great hall was stark, but it reflected the dual nature of knighthood. A knight was expected to be both warrior and gentleman. At night, when the manor had grown quiet and the other pages slept, the boy would sometimes stare at the rafters and imagine the future. He dreamed of shining armor, of gallant deeds performed on the battlefield, of banners flying as lords hailed his courage. Yet he also felt the gnawing fear of failure, the knowledge that one misstep, one act of cowardice could cost him his future. This fear drove him to work harder than ever, determined not to disappoint the lord who had taken him in or the father who had sent him here. By the time the first year of his service was complete, the boy was no longer the timid child who had arrived in the courtyard. His hands were calloused, his shoulders broader, his mind sharper. He had learned to wake before dawn without complaint, to serve without hesitation, and to fight without fear. The brutal life of a knight in training had begun to shape him, body and soul. Though the road ahead would only grow harder, he was ready to take the next step, becoming a squire. The boy's second year in service began much like the first, with dawn breaking cold and gray over the manor and the ringing of the chapel bell calling him from his straw mattress. He had grown accustomed to the early hours and the brisk chill of the stone floors against his bare feet, but there was still a part of him that longed for the comfort of his mother's hearth and the sound of his siblings' laughter. Childhood was slipping away, replaced by routine and duty. He was a page now in every sense of the word, an apprentice to the warrior's life, molded by the relentless structure of the household. Each day followed a rhythm as steady as the tolling of the bell. Morning prayers were first, for no knight could claim to fight with honor if he neglected the salvation of his soul. He stood beside the other pages and squires in the small chapel, shivering slightly as the priest's Latin chants echoed in the cold air. Then came breakfast, dark bread, a slice of cheese, perhaps a bit of watered ale if the season was generous. There was no lingering at table. As soon as the meal was done, the steward barked orders and the boys scattered to their tasks. Pages were expected to be everywhere, doing everything. One moment the boy might be polishing the lord's sword until it gleamed, the next he might be scrubbing mud from the hooves of a destrier. He learned the care of weapons, from oiling a blade to straightening a bent spearhead with hammer and anvil. He learned to saddle and bridle horses quickly and correctly, skills that would one day mean life or death on a battlefield. He even learned to assist the armorer, helping to rivet plates and mend chainmail, tasks that left his fingers raw and aching. Each chore was a lesson, and though he sometimes muttered under his breath, he soon understood that this work was teaching him respect for the tools of war. There were humiliations too. The Lord's Hall was a place of ceremony, and as a page the boy was expected to serve at table. He carried trenchers of food to the knights, poured wine into goblets, and stood at the ready to fetch anything the diners might demand. A spilled drink or a clumsy misstep could bring a sharp rebuke, or worse, laughter from the older squires, which stung the boy's pride far more than punishment. These moments hardened him, teaching him to keep his face calm even when his ears burned with shame. When his household duties were complete, the boy trained. Wooden swords, wooden shields, and endless practice. His days were filled with the thud of weapon on target and the sting of bruises forming on his arms and shins. He sparred against the other pages, often leaving the yard with a split lip or a blackened eye, but never with tears. To cry was to show weakness, and weakness was a thing the master-at-arms had no patience for. "Pain is the tutor of a warrior," the old soldier growled as he watched them fight. "Let it teach you." Despite the harshness, there were moments of joy. On feast days, the boy was allowed to watch the knights and squires compete in mock justs. He stood at the edge of the tilt yard, breathless as the armored figures thundered past, lances shattering on shields with a sound like snapping trees. He cheered when one of the household knights unhorsed his opponent and basked in the thought that someday he too might ride in such contests. At night, when the hall grew quiet, he sometimes crept near the hearth where the men-at-arms gathered to tell tales of past campaigns. He listened wide-eyed to stories of battles fought under distant banners, of castles stormed and treasures taken, of comrades slain and avenged. These stories fired his imagination and gave shape to the man he hoped to become. Yet page life was not all glory and anticipation. The boy also saw the uglier side of knighthood. Once, after a skirmish on the border, wounded soldiers were brought to the manor. The boy was tasked with helping the surgeon tend to them. He saw men groaning with fever, their flesh blackened by infection. He saw a squire's leg sawed off with a dull blade, heard the scream that followed, and held the poor youth down as the surgeon worked. That night he could not sleep, the sound of the screaming echoing in his ears. He realized then that war was not only a thing of honor and banners but also of blood, suffering, and death. The seasons marked the passing of time. In summer, the pages rode out to hunt with the Lord, galloping through the sunlit forest with hounds baying at their heels. In autumn, they helped oversee the harvest, standing watch as peasants delivered grain to the Lord's granary. Winter was the hardest, for the cold seeped through the stone walls and food grew scarce. On long, dark evenings, the boy would huddle near the fire, practicing knots or carving wooden toys with his belt knife. Even then he was never idle. Idleness was frowned upon, a sign of weakness or laziness. The page also learned lessons that could not be taught with sword or scripture. He observed the lord and lady as they handled disputes between peasants, managed the stores of grain, or negotiated with visiting envoys. These moments taught him the art of leadership, the weight of justice, the importance of keeping one's word, the balance between mercy and authority. A knight was not merely a fighter but a man of responsibility, and this truth began to take root in the boy's mind. By the time he neared the age of 14, the boy was no longer soft-faced or timid. He stood taller, his shoulders squared from the years of labor and training. His hands were rough, his gaze steady. The other pages respected him, and even the older squires sometimes offered him a nod of approval. The lord of the house, too, had taken notice. One evening, after a particularly grueling day of training, the lord clapped a hand on the boy's shoulder and said, "You're nearly ready to serve as a squire. Make yourself worthy of the sword you will soon carry." That night, the boy lay awake long after the candles had been snuffed out, staring into the darkness. The word "squire" echoed in his mind, filling him with a mixture of excitement and dread. It was the next great step on his path, one that would bring him closer to the knighthood he had dreamed of since childhood, but also closer to the dangers of war and the brutal realities of the life he had chosen. He clenched his fists beneath his blanket and whispered a prayer to God, asking for strength. Whatever trials lay ahead, he was ready to face them. The day of his elevation came in early spring, when the snow had melted and the roads were once again passable. The boy was summoned to the great hall, where the Lord sat in the carved oak chair that served as his seat of judgment. A few of the household knights stood nearby, their faces solemn. The boy knelt before them, his heart pounding so hard he thought they must surely hear it. The Lord regarded him for a long moment before speaking. "You have served faithfully as a page," he said, his voice carrying through the hall. "You have shown obedience, diligence, and courage. It is time you take the next step." He turned to one of the knights, a broad-shouldered man with a thick beard and eyes like chips of flint. "Sir Roderick, you will take this boy as your squire." The knight stepped forward, his heavy boots thudding against the rush-strewn floor. He looked the boy over as though measuring a blade for sharpness. Then he gave a single, approving nod. "He will do," he said simply. The boy was told to rise and was presented with a new tunic bearing Sir Roderick's colors. From this day forward, he was no longer merely a servant of the household but the personal attendant of a knight. His training would intensify, his responsibilities deepen, and his mistakes carry greater consequences. Becoming a squire meant leaving behind much of the camaraderie of page life. The boy moved his belongings into a small chamber adjoining Sir Roderick's quarters. There was no one to share the space with now, no giggling companions to whisper with after dark. Instead, he rose each morning to the sound of his master's voice, barking orders before the sun had even climbed above the horizon. His first task was to see to the knight's horse. The destrier was a massive warhorse, nearly as intimidating as the knight himself. The boy learned to groom it thoroughly, checking hooves for stones, combing out its mane, and feeding it carefully measured rations of oats. Sir Roderick was exacting in his standards. If the horse's tack was dirty or the animal showed the least sign of neglect, the boy would face a tongue lashing that left his ears burning. Armor maintenance was another of his duties and one of the most grueling. A knight's harness of mail and plate was heavy, cumbersome, and easily fouled by rust if not constantly tended. The squire spent long hours with rag and oil, polishing each link of chain until it gleamed. He learned to strap the pieces of plate armor in the correct order, buckling and unbuckling them so often that the motions became second nature. He also learned to carry the armor himself, no easy feat for it weighed nearly as much as he did. When the knight rode out, the squire trotted behind with shield, lance, and spare sword in tow, ready to supply them at a moment's notice. Combat training grew harsher as well. The wooden practice sword was replaced with a blunted steel one, heavier and more punishing to the arms. The squire sparred daily, not just with other squires but occasionally with Sir Roderick himself, who had little patience for timidity. "You must strike as though your life depends on it," the knight growled as he rained blows upon the boy's guard. "Because one day it will." Bruises became his constant companions, purple blooms on his forearms, welts on his ribs, even the occasional cut when a strike slipped past his defense. Yet with each wound the boy grew faster, stronger, more precise. Being a squire also meant accompanying Sir Roderick wherever he went. When the knight attended his lord, the squire stood at his side, bearing his weapons and ready to assist. When Roderick hunted, the squire followed on horseback, learning to ride at speed through the tangled forest and to retrieve the game once it was down. When Roderick inspected the villages, the squire rode behind him, watching as the knight collected rents, settled disputes, and occasionally delivered punishment to those who had broken the law. It was an education in the duties of power, and the boy observed it all with wide, serious eyes. For the first time, the squire began to taste the true danger of the knight's life. On one occasion, Sir Roderick was summoned to deal with a band of outlaws who had been harassing travelers on the road. The squire accompanied him and several men-at-arms on the hunt. When they found the bandits' camp, a brief but vicious skirmish broke out. The squire's job was not to fight but to stay close to the horses, ready to bring fresh weapons if needed or help a wounded man retreat. Even so, he saw blood spilled for the first time outside of training, saw a man struck down with a sword, heard his dying groan, smelled the coppery tang of blood in the air. His stomach churned, but he forced himself to stay steady. When it was over, Sir Roderick clapped him on the shoulder. "You didn't run," he said gruffly. "That's a start." Life as a squire was lonely at times. The other squires were rivals as much as companions, each vying to prove himself worthy of eventual knighthood. Fights sometimes broke out between them, not always in the practice yard. But the squire learned to hold his temper, for Sir Roderick valued discipline above all. Instead of brawling, he threw himself into his duties, striving to earn his master's approval. Slowly he began to win it. On feast days, when the lord's hall was crowded with guests, Sir Roderick would sometimes gesture for him to sit near the hearth and listen to the knight's conversations, a small but meaningful privilege. By the time 2 years had passed, the squire had grown into a young man. His once slender frame had filled out with muscle, his hands hardened by labor and his face set with quiet resolve. He was no longer merely serving a knight, he was beginning to think and act like one. He had learned to anticipate Roderick's needs before they were spoken, to read the mood of the hall and know when to speak and when to stay silent. He had learned that courage was not the absence of fear but the mastery of it. And yet, even with all his progress, the road ahead was far from complete. He had not yet been tested in true battle, had not yet earned the right to kneel and take the oath of knighthood. That day still lay in the future, and the boy, now nearly a man, could feel it drawing closer. Each dawn brought with it more training, more lessons, more opportunities to prove himself worthy of the sword and spurs. One day soon he knew he would be called upon to fight at his knight's side, not just to watch. And when that day came, he vowed to meet it without hesitation, for he had chosen this life and would see it through, no matter how brutal it became. The years that followed were the hardest of the young man's life. He had been a page full of bright-eyed dreams, eager to hold a sword and prove himself. Now, as a squire, he learned the weight of duty, not just the physical weight of the knight's gear which he hauled daily, but the crushing responsibility of living up to the expectations placed upon him. The path to knighthood was not paved with glory but with sweat, exhaustion, and 100 thankless tasks performed day after day. Dawn was no longer merely the start of a day, it was a test. The squire was awake before the first cock crowed, shivering in the chill of the early morning as he made his way to the stables. Sir Roderick's destrier had to be brushed until its coat shone, its hooves picked clean, its feed mixed and measured precisely. The knight demanded perfection. If the animal's tack was even slightly misfastened, the squire would be ordered to redo it all and then run laps around the yard until his legs ached. Sometimes this punishment was delivered with a boot to the backside to remind him to work faster. After the stables came the armory. The knight's mail hauberk was heavy and prone to rust, and keeping it in fighting condition was a laborious task. The squire spent hours seated on a stool with an oiled rag in hand, rubbing each ring clean, listening to the faint rasp of metal on metal until his fingers were blackened and sore. The plate armor too needed constant care. He polished the breastplate until he could see his reflection in it, checked every strap for wear, and learned to repair torn leather bindings. If battle was coming, he was expected to have everything ready: helmet, gauntlets, spurs, sword, lance and shield, in perfect order before his master mounted his horse. And then there was training. If the squire thought that becoming a squire meant more freedom, he quickly learned otherwise. Sir Roderick pushed him harder than ever before. He drilled daily with sword and shield until his arms were like lead. He ran drills in full mail, sweating beneath the weight until his tunic clung to his skin. He practiced mounting and dismounting with speed, vaulting onto the destrier even while burdened with a shield. There were days he returned to the barracks so exhausted that he collapsed onto his straw pallet without even removing his boots. Squirehood was also a test of the mind. Sir Roderick expected him to remember every detail of a campaign: how many men were needed for a watch, what supplies to bring on a raid, how to build a camp so that no soldier went without fire or shelter. He quizzed the squire constantly, even during meals, and cuffed him if he gave the wrong answer. "A knight who forgets his duty forgets his life," Roderick would say. "And I won't have a dead fool serving under me." The burdens were not merely physical or intellectual, they were emotional as well. A squire was expected to be loyal to his master in all things. He was present when Roderick dealt with matters of justice, sometimes even standing watch during floggings or executions. The first time the squire witnessed a hanging, his stomach turned, but he kept his face impassive, knowing that any show of weakness would draw the knight's scorn. He also accompanied Roderick to councils and feasts, standing silently behind him as knights and lords debated matters of war and politics. It was here that the squire began to understand that knighthood was as much about power and influence as it was about battle. His duties extended to the field as well. When Sir Roderick went hunting, the squire ran alongside, carrying spears and retrieving kills. When the knight went on patrol, the squire rode behind him, scanning the woods for danger. Once, when the party was ambushed by brigands, the squire had to help drag a wounded man back to the horses while arrows whistled past. He was terrified, but his body moved without hesitation. Proof that all the drills, all the punishments, all the hours of training were shaping him into someone who could act under pressure. The other squires were both companions and rivals. They trained together, ate together, and sometimes bled together, but each one secretly hoped to outshine the others and earn his spurs first. Fights broke out in the yard, often with fists rather than swords. The squire learned to defend himself quickly, for to be humiliated in front of the others was to lose face. Yet these rivalries also forged a bond among them, for they all knew the hardships of this path. Late at night, when the day's duties were done, they would sit together by the dying embers of the fire, whispering their hopes and fears, of glory on the battlefield, of death in some nameless ditch, of whether their lords truly valued them. The burdens of squirehood were heavy, but they were forging the young man into steel. His body grew harder with each season, his arms stronger from lifting armor, his reflexes quicker from sparring. His spirit too was being tempered, pride beaten out of him, discipline hammered in, humility learned through toil. When Sir Roderick looked at him now, it was with something close to respect. And yet, the squire knew that the greatest test still lay ahead. All his work, all his sweat and pain, were merely preparation for the moment when he would ride into battle for the first time. He did not know when that moment would come, only that it would. The knights spoke often of the unrest on the border, of raiding parties and rival lords plotting war. One night, as the squire lay staring at the rafters, he heard Roderick speaking quietly to another knight about an upcoming campaign. His heart pounded as he realized that soon he might have his chance to prove himself, not in practice but in the real and bloody trial of combat. The thought both thrilled and terrified him. He had been trained to face death, but he had never yet stared into its eyes. Soon he would. And when that day came, he swore silently he would not falter. The burdens of squirehood had prepared him for this. He was ready, at least as ready as any young man could ever be, to face the brutal life of a knight on the battlefield. The summons to war came at dawn on a gray, wind-bitten morning. The manor yard bustled with activity as men-at-arms assembled, horses were saddled, and supplies were loaded onto wagons. The squire stood beside Sir Roderick's destrier, hands steady as he tightened the girth and checked the saddle straps one last time. His heart was hammering in his chest, but he tried not to let it show. Today was the day he had been waiting for, and dreading, for years. He was no longer just a servant or a student. Today he would ride with his knight into battle. Sir Roderick approached, already clad in his mail hauberk, his surcoat bearing his family's colors. He gave the squire a sharp nod. "Armor," he said simply. The squire worked quickly, fastening the knight's greaves and vambraces, adjusting the straps of his breastplate until it sat snug against his chest. Last came the helmet, polished so bright it reflected the pale light of morning. When all was in place, Roderick mounted in one fluid motion, and the squire handed him his lance. The column of riders moved out, the sound of hooves pounding the frozen earth. The squire rode just behind Roderick, his pack heavy with spare weapons, water skins and bandages. His own sword hung at his hip, a blunted practice blade no longer. This was a true weapon, sharpened and deadly. He touched its hilt now and again as though to reassure himself it was real. They rode for hours through fields and woodlands until they reached the borderlands where the enemy had been raiding. Smoke rose in the distance, thin and gray against the sky, marking the remains of burned villages. The smell of it turned the squire's stomach. This was no training exercise. This was war. When they finally sighted the enemy, another lord's retinue, similarly armored, their banners snapping in the wind, Sir Roderick reined in his horse and called the men together. Orders were given quickly, efficiently. The knights formed up for a charge, lances couched. The men-at-arms tightened their grips on spears and shields. The squire's mouth went dry. "You stay close to me," Roderick ordered. "When I call for a fresh weapon, you bring it. If I'm unhorsed, you're the first to my side. Do you understand?" "Yes, my lord," the squire said, though his voice trembled slightly. The moment came. With a cry, the knights spurred their horses forward, and the squire galloped behind them. The ground seemed to shake beneath the charge. The squire's vision tunneled, focused only on the enemy line rushing closer. He could hear the thunder of hooves, the clash of armor, the shouts of men. Then, with a sound like a tree breaking in a storm, the lines collided. The squire saw Roderick's lance strike home, splintering as it knocked an enemy rider from his saddle. The squire swerved to avoid a fallen horse, nearly losing his seat. Men shouted, swords rang against shields, and the air was filled with the grunts of combat. It was chaos, nothing like the ordered drills of the training yard. Roderick discarded his broken lance and drew his sword. "Fresh lance," he shouted, and the squire fumbled to pass him another. His hands were slick with sweat, but he managed it just in time before another rider closed on them. Roderick swung his sword, cleaving into the man's shoulder. Blood sprayed, hot and metallic in the cold air. The squire stared for a moment, frozen, but then remembered himself and wheeled his horse around to stay close to his master. The fighting raged for what felt like hours but was likely only minutes. The squire saw men he knew cut down before his eyes. One of the other squires was thrown from his horse and trampled by panicked mounts. The squire wanted to turn away, but he forced himself to watch, to learn. This was the reality of battle, the brutal truth hidden behind the romantic tales told in the great hall. At one point, Roderick was unhorsed, knocked to the ground by a blow from a mace. The squire leaped from his saddle, sword in hand, heart hammering. He planted himself at Roderick's side, swinging wildly at an enemy soldier who charged toward them. The blow connected, biting into the man's thigh, and he fell back with a cry. It was the first time the squire had struck a man with intent to kill. His stomach lurched, but he did not falter. He grabbed Roderick's arm and helped him back to his feet. "Good lad," the knight grunted as he remounted. "Stay alive." The tide of battle slowly turned. Their side drove the enemy back, cutting them down or forcing them to flee. When it was over, the field was littered with bodies, men and horses alike. The squire dismounted, legs trembling, and helped bind the wounds of the injured. His hands shook as he worked, but he did not stop until every man who could be saved was bandaged. That night they camped near the battlefield. The squire sat by the fire, staring into the flames, the sounds of battle still echoing in his ears. His clothes were stained with blood, some of it his own, most of it not. He felt hollow, as though some part of him had been left behind on the field with the dead. Sir Roderick sat beside him, silent for a time. At last he spoke. "You did well today," he said quietly. "You didn't run. You kept your head. That's more than some men manage in their first fight." The squire nodded but said nothing. He was too tired to speak, too full of thoughts he could not put into words. He had faced death and survived. He had killed a man and lived to feel the weight of it. He had taken his first step into the brutal, bloody world of knighthood, and there was no turning back. When he finally lay down to sleep, the ground was cold beneath him, the stars sharp and distant above. He closed his eyes and whispered a prayer, not for glory, not for victory, but simply for the strength to endure whatever battles lay ahead. The campaign dragged on for several months, but when it ended, the young squire returned to the manor a different man. The fear that had once plagued him before battle was still there, but it had changed, become something sharper, something he could use. He had learned to ride through the terror, to think clearly while steel rang around him. Sir Roderick had taken notice. One evening, as they dismounted after a long patrol, the knight turned to him and said, "It is time you stood among us, lad. You are ready." Those words struck him harder than any blow he had taken in training. Ready. The moment he had waited for since childhood was finally at hand. He was to be knighted. The lord of the castle confirmed it the next morning, summoning him to the great hall and informing him that the dubbing ceremony would take place at the end of the week. The news spread quickly through the household. The other squires clapped him on the back, some with genuine smiles, others with barely concealed envy. The days that followed were filled with preparation, not just for the ceremony but for the transformation of his soul. Tradition demanded that a squire spend the night before his knighting in a vigil of prayer, fasting and cleansing his spirit for the life he was about to take on. He was given a bath, his first in weeks, his hair trimmed and his face clean-shaven. Fresh linen garments were laid out for him, symbolizing purity. The castle's chaplain met with him, hearing his confession and offering absolution, so that he would stand before God without sin when he took his vows. That evening the great hall was cleared. Candles burned in every corner, casting long, wavering shadows across the stone walls. The squire entered barefoot, dressed in a simple white tunic, and knelt before the altar where a sword and spurs had been placed. These would be his, if he proved worthy. The chaplain led him through prayers, then left him alone in the silent hall. Hours passed. He knelt, then stood, then knelt again, fighting exhaustion as the night wore on. His thoughts were a storm, memories of childhood games with wooden swords, of the grueling training under Roderick's watchful eye, of the faces of men who had fallen in battle. He thought of the man he had killed, and he asked God to forgive him if his heart had felt pride in that moment. He asked for courage, for strength, for wisdom to know when to show mercy and when to strike without hesitation. When dawn finally broke, he felt as though he had been remade. He was weary to the bone, but there was a strange lightness within him, as though he had left behind the last remnants of the boy he had been. The ceremony itself was solemn and beautiful. The lord of the castle, resplendent in his own armor, stood waiting as the squire approached. The household gathered to watch. Knights, ladies, servants, even peasants allowed in for the occasion. First came the ritual of investiture. A servant buckled a pair of golden spurs onto the squire's heels, the symbol of his new station. Then he was girded with a sword, its hilt kissed by the chaplain to bless it. The Lord spoke as he presented it, "Take this sword, and with it take the duty to defend the weak, protect the church, and serve your liege with honor." Then came the final, most important moment, the accolade. The squire knelt before his lord, head bowed. The lord raised his hand and struck him lightly on each shoulder with the flat of the sword. "In the name of God, Saint Michael and Saint George, I dub thee knight. Arise, sir." The hall erupted into cheers as he rose, no longer a squire but a knight in full standing. He felt the weight of the sword at his side, the spurs at his heels, and with them the weight of a life that was no longer his own. He was bound by the code of chivalry now, not merely as a student, but as one sworn before God and man. After the ceremony came the feast. The great hall was alive with music, laughter, and the clatter of trenchers. Wine flowed freely and roasted meats were piled high on the tables. Knights toasted him, some joking that now he would have to earn his bread by leading charges instead of carrying lances. Even Roderick smiled, rare and fleeting, and said, "You've done well, lad. You carry my colors now, not just my sword." Yet amid the celebration, the new knight could not help but feel the sobering reality of what had just happened. This was not the end of his journey, it was only the beginning. The title he bore was not merely an honor but a burden. He had sworn to defend the helpless, to uphold justice, to fight for his lord and his faith. He had seen enough war to know that those vows would not always be easy to keep. Later, when the feast had ended and the hall grew quiet, he stood alone on the battlements, looking out over the darkened fields. The stars were sharp and cold above, and the wind tugged at his cloak. Somewhere beyond the hills, there would be more battles, more raids, more men waiting to test his steel. He knew that tomorrow he would begin training again, harder than before, this time not as a student, but as one expected to lead, to inspire others by example. He gripped the hilt of his sword and whispered a final prayer, not for glory but for guidance. He had been given a place among the Brotherhood of Knights. Now he would have to prove day after day that he deserved it. The first weeks after his knighting were a haze of pride and purpose. The young man, now Sir Aldric, for that was the name he had chosen to bear into history, felt the weight of his new title in every step. Men-at-arms saluted him when he passed, peasants bowed their heads, and the squires looked at him with a mixture of respect and envy. Yet alongside the pride came a gnawing sense of unease. It was one thing to vow before God to uphold the ideals of knighthood. It was another to live by them in a world that was anything but ideal. The code of chivalry had been drilled into him since childhood. To defend the church, protect the weak, speak the truth, show mercy to the vanquished, and serve his lord with loyalty. These were noble, shining words. But reality soon showed him that each vow could cut two ways, and that the path of honor was seldom straight. His first test came only days after the feast of his knighting. A pair of peasants were dragged into the bailey by the manor's reeve, accused of stealing a sheep from the lord's flock. They were ragged and starving, their faces hollow from a long, harsh winter. Sir Aldric stood beside Sir Roderick as the trial was held. The peasants admitted to the theft but pleaded for mercy, explaining that their children were dying of hunger. The law was clear: theft from the lord's flock was a hanging offense. The steward recommended the sentence without hesitation. Sir Roderick glanced at Aldric as if inviting him to speak. This was his first chance to act as a knight, to exercise justice. Every lesson he had been taught urged him to be merciful, to protect the helpless. But mercy for the thieves might embolden others to steal, and hunger could quickly turn into rebellion. Sir Aldric hesitated, feeling the eyes of the court on him, then said quietly that he would ask the Lord to commute the sentence to flogging and a season's labor in the fields. The peasants wept with gratitude, but the reeve muttered that it was too lenient. Later, Roderick told him bluntly, "You did what you thought was right. Just remember, your first duty is to keep order. A knight's mercy must never make him look weak." It was a lesson Aldric would struggle with for years, that chivalry demanded both compassion and severity, and that balancing the two was often a matter of judgment, not clear rule. His second test came on the field. That spring, the lord rode to war against a neighboring baron who had refused to pay homage. Aldric led a small troop of men-at-arms in the raid. They burned fields, toppled fences, and carried off livestock, just as the enemy had done to them. When they came upon a village, Aldric ordered his men not to harm the women or children, but some of the soldiers grumbled that they should take what they pleased as spoils. That night, Aldric confronted one of the men who had struck a farmer during the raid. "You swore an oath when you took service under our banner," he said coldly. "If you cannot restrain your hand, you will answer to me." The man sneered and muttered about soft-hearted knights, but Aldric knew he had to act. The next morning he had the soldier publicly flogged. It earned him no friends among the rougher men, but it established that his word was law. This too was part of chivalry, to command respect through justice even when it meant being feared. Temptation came in quieter ways as well. At the castle, noble women watched him differently now that he was a knight, no longer just a squire. There was the lady of the hall, young and fair, who spoke with him often when Roderick was away. There were wandering minstrels who sang of knights who risked everything for love, of secret meetings under moonlit trees. Sir Aldric felt the pull of such stories, but he knew that one careless act could lead to scandal, or even bloodshed if a jealous husband learned of it. He also began to see how politics twisted even the most sacred vows. There were knights who swore loyalty to a lord one season and broke faith the next when a richer patron offered better land. There were lords who spoke of justice but used war as an excuse to seize more territory. Aldrich found himself in council meetings where deals were struck that left peasants worse off, but no one spoke against them because it would offend the powerful. It was during one such council that he first felt the weight of compromise. His lord proposed raising taxes on the villages to fund repairs to the castle walls. Aldrich knew the villagers had barely survived the last winter and another poor harvest could break them. He wanted to speak up, to urge mercy, but when he saw the stern faces of the other knights, he bit his tongue. Speaking out could make him look disloyal, and a knight who lost his lord's trust could lose everything. That night, alone in the chapel, he knelt before the altar and prayed for guidance. "How can I serve both my lord and the people under his care?" he whispered. "How do I keep my honor when every choice has a cost?" There was no voice from heaven to answer him, only the flickering of the candle flame. But in that silence he made a vow to himself. He would not let the code of chivalry become just words. Even if he faltered, even if the world around him turned gray, he would strive to do what was just. Living by the code was not easy. It was not romantic or shining as the minstrel's songs made it seem. It was a daily battle, fought not with swords but with choices, small ones, hard ones, that shaped who he was becoming. And Sir Aldrich knew that in the years ahead, the tests would only grow harder. After the campaign ended and the Lord's banner was once again furled above the gatehouse, life settled into the steady rhythm of the castle. Sir Aldrich discovered that the life of a knight, though marked by moments of fierce glory, was built largely on routine, discipline that began with the rising sun and did not end until the torches were doused at night. Each morning began early, long before the castle stirred to full life. The air was damp and chill as Aldrich donned a simple tunic and headed to the yard for drills. Knights who neglected their training soon lost their edge, and he refused to be caught unprepared when the next summons to war came. With other knights and squires, he practiced swordplay against wooden posts, thrusting and cutting until sweat darkened his shirt. He drilled with the lance, charging at the quinton until his shoulder ached. There were days he practiced until his palms blistered, then kept going, wrapping the hilt of his sword with rags so he could grip it despite the sting. In the afternoons he often joined the hunt. Hunting was both a sport and a necessity, providing meat for the Lord's table and training for war. Aldrich rode through the green woods, hawk on his arm or spear in hand, listening for the baying of hounds. The thrill of the chase, the rush of the horse beneath him, the final cry as the quarry was brought down, these moments stirred something in him that was almost primal. Yet even here there were rules. The Lord's forests were jealously guarded, and to hunt without leave was a crime. Aldrich saw poachers hanged for stealing a single deer. It reminded him that the knight's duty was not just to fight enemies abroad, but to enforce his lord's justice at home. Between the hunts and the training came matters of administration. As a knight in his lord's service, Aldrich was expected to act as a steward when called upon, hearing disputes among the peasants, collecting rents, or escorting merchants who paid tolls at the bridge. He learned to keep records, tallying how much grain was stored for winter, how many oxen were fit for plowing. These tasks were not glorious but they were necessary. A lord's power was measured not just in swords but in the wealth of his land, and a knight who could manage that wealth wisely was a valuable man. Evenings were often spent in the great hall, where life within the castle's walls gathered into one space. Torches blazed on the walls, and the air filled with the smell of roasted meat and wood smoke. Aldrich would sit at the long table with the other knights, sharing trenchers of bread and ale, listening to minstrels sing of battles fought long ago. Sometimes the lord would discuss politics over supper, rumors of rival lords, whispers of rebellion, or news from the king's court. Aldrich learned to keep his ears open and his tongue guarded. A careless word spoken over wine could start a feud. The hall was also where rivalries and friendships were forged. Tensions flared easily when too much drink was poured, and Aldrich found himself breaking up more than one brawl between hot-tempered young knights. There were games of dice, wagers on the next tournament, boasts of past deeds. Aldrich was careful not to let pride get the better of him. He knew that reputation was as much a weapon as any sword. Not every evening was spent in mirth. Some were given over to prayer in the chapel, where the chaplain reminded them that their swords were pledged to God's service as well as their lord's. Aldrich knelt with the others, the flickering candlelight catching on their mail, and wondered how many of them truly lived by the vows they spoke. Despite the peace of these months, danger was never far. There were times when a messenger would ride in, mud-spattered and breathless, with news of raiders sighted near the border. Then the yard would erupt with activity as knights prepared to ride. More than once, Aldrich found himself in the saddle before dawn, leading a small party to track the enemy. Sometimes they found only empty fields and burned farmsteads. Other times they caught the raiders and clashed with them in a flurry of steel and shouts. When the fields lay quiet, there were tournaments to look forward to. These were the great spectacles of peacetime, where knights could test their skill and win honor. Aldrich trained for weeks before each one, perfecting his lance technique, practicing with sword and mace. He entered the lists with his lord's colors streaming from his helm, the cheers of the crowd ringing in his ears. The blows were real, the danger real. More than one knight had died from a broken neck, but the chance to prove himself was irresistible. When he unhorsed an opponent in a clean strike, the rush of pride was like nothing else he had felt. And yet, even in victory, Aldrich remained aware of the fragile balance of castle life. He saw how easily a poor harvest could sour the mood of the entire manor, how a single argument between knights could turn into a blood feud. He saw the quiet desperation of peasants who worked themselves half to death to pay their rents, and the discontent that brewed when justice seemed unevenly applied. All these experiences, training, hunting, governing, feasting, fighting, shaped Aldrich into a different kind of knight than he had been on the day of his dubbing. He began to see that knighthood was not merely a matter of skill at arms, but of constant vigilance, of being ready at all times to defend, to lead, to judge, and to restrain. Castle life was not soft living. It was a crucible that tested a man's patience as much as his courage. And deep down, Aldrich knew that this time of relative peace was only a pause between storms. The world beyond the castle walls was restless. Sooner or later, war would come again, and when it did, he would need to be sharper, stronger, and more cunning than ever before. The calm of castle life was shattered when word arrived that the neighboring kingdom had breached the border. Sir Aldrich, now a seasoned knight, readied himself once more for a campaign that promised not only glory but death. The march began before dawn, the air heavy with mist, and the ground churned by the hooves of horses and wheels of wagons carrying supplies, siege engines, and the sickly sweet smell of the packed army. Men-at-arms jostled one another, squires struggled to keep up with their masters, and Aldrich adjusted the straps on his mail, feeling the familiar weight of steel against his chest. The first days were deceptively easy. Scouts returned with reports of empty villages and abandoned farmland. Hunger gnawed at the men's bellies, and tempers flared easily when food was scarce. Sir Aldrich distributed rations fairly, ensuring the weakest received enough to survive, but even this small measure could not prevent grumbling. Discipline was constantly tested on the march. Horses grew exhausted and soldiers' boots wore through, blistering their feet. Aldrich learned quickly to recognize the signs of fatigue in men and mounts alike, for a tired soldier was a dangerous soldier, more likely to make a mistake or bolt under attack. Night brought little rest. Camps were makeshift, fires kept alive to fend off the chill and to cook the meager rations, but exhaustion came in waves. Aldrich often found himself standing guard, sword in hand, listening to the distant sounds of wildlife, or enemy scouts, prowling near the perimeter. Sleep was fitful, broken by the cries of sentries warning of approaching riders or the groans of men suffering from illness or injury. Disease was as deadly as any sword, and Aldrich witnessed men he had trained with fall to fevers that seemed to strike overnight. When battle finally came, it was nothing like the small skirmishes he had faced as a squire. Thousands of men clashed on a muddy field, banners snapping in the wind, the ground vibrating with the pounding of hooves. Siege engines thundered in the distance, hurling stones that shattered shields and splintered timber. The air was thick with dust, smoke, and the metallic scent of blood. Aldrich's heart raced as he spurred his horse forward, sword in hand, leading a charge into the enemy's flank. The clash of steel rang in his ears as he parried, struck, and maneuvered among a sea of armored men. Sieges were even worse. Towns defended by thick walls required days or weeks of encampment, and supplies dwindled while disease and hunger ravaged the men. Aldrich learned to ration food, to keep morale high even when the stench of filth and death was everywhere. Nights were sleepless, with arrows fired over the walls and the occasional assault on the gates. Each day brought new fatigue, new fear, new moments when a single misstep could mean death. Yet through it all, Aldrich held fast, leading small contingents on raids outside the walls, bringing in firewood, tending the wounded, or helping to repair siege ladders. The brutality of war tested more than his body. He was forced to make choices that would haunt him for years. Men who deserted or stole during the campaign were often executed, sometimes publicly, and Aldrich, as a commanding knight, had to witness, or even oversee, such punishments. He saw the thin line between justice and cruelty, and felt the weight of responsibility pressing down on his conscience. When towns fell, the looting and pillaging were nearly inevitable. Aldrich tried to enforce discipline, protecting civilians when he could, but not all men listened. Houses were burned, food stolen, and women and children sometimes harmed despite his warnings. He learned quickly that a knight could only control so much. Beyond his own men, chaos reigned. The ideal of chivalry clashed with the harsh necessities of war, and each campaign left a scar on his soul, even when it added to his skill as a soldier. Long marches between engagements were themselves grueling. Days blurred together as the army traversed forests, rivers, and marshes. Horses were starved, packs were overloaded, and feet blistered. Aldrich often rode at the head of the column, encouraging the weary, resolving disputes among the men, and keeping an eye on the enemy. He learned to read the landscape for ambushes, to scout ahead with limited men, and to ration supplies meticulously. Survival required vigilance at every moment. Despite the hardships, moments of camaraderie existed. Around evening fires, men shared stories, jokes, and the meager food they had managed to save. Squires, now older and more confident, looked to Aldrich for guidance. He gave what counsel he could, aware that leadership meant protecting not only the lives but the spirits of those under his command. When a soldier collapsed from exhaustion or illness, Aldrich was there to offer support, whether with water, bandages, or simply a steadying hand. By the time the campaign ended and the army returned to friendly lands, Sir Aldrich was physically exhausted and mentally drained. He had witnessed horrors no songs or tales could fully convey, had killed men whose eyes mirrored his own, and had seen the consequences of his orders in stark reality. Yet he had survived, proven himself, and honed the skills that separated a true knight from one merely wearing the title. The campaigns left him changed. Castle life after war was quieter, almost painfully so, yet Aldrich now carried the knowledge that peace was fragile, and that his role was never truly over. He had learned that knighthood was not simply about courage in battle. It was about endurance, judgment, and the ability to survive morally as well as physically. And though the brutality of war had left scars both visible and unseen, it had also forged in him the hardened resolve that would define the rest of his life. Life between campaigns demanded more than patience, it demanded skill. Knights like Sir Aldrich were expected to maintain peak prowess even when the battlefield lay far behind. Tournaments and justs offered that opportunity, a place to test skill, gain renown, and even win prizes worthy of a noble house. But they were not mere games. They were bloody, dangerous contests where a single mistake could end a career, or a life. Spring brought the first tournament of the season. Aldrich rode into the field outside the town, banners streaming in the wind, the scent of straw and sweat thick in the air. The crowd was immense, a mixture of townsfolk, merchants, and nobles. Music filled the air, drumming and horns signaling the beginning of the day's contests. Knights from neighboring lands had arrived, many boasting of past victories, their armor polished to a gleaming perfection. Aldrich tightened his gauntlets, checking the weight of his lance, and mounted his destrier, feeling the familiar surge of adrenaline. The lists, the arena for the joust, were narrow, flanked by wooden barriers to prevent horses from veering off course. Each knight was paired against another, and the rules were simple yet unforgiving. Strike the opponent with the lance to unhorse him, or hit his shield with enough force to score points. Spectators cheered and shouted advice, their voices blending into a roar that made the horses skittish. The first passes were cautious. Aldrich felt the power of the lance transfer through his arms, the jolt of his horse as it galloped straight down the lists, and the momentary fear that the opposing knight's weapon could pierce his armor or knock him from the saddle. When the first collision came, it was a thunderous crack. Lances splintered, horses stumbled, and men were hurled from their mounts with bone-jarring force. Aldrich's heart leaped as he narrowly avoided the brunt of his opponent's strike, guiding his horse to absorb the impact and countering with a well-placed blow to the other knight's shield. The risk was real. Injuries were frequent, ranging from broken bones to concussions, and even death occurred, though less often than the stories claimed. Aldrich had witnessed a young knight the previous season suffer a shattered leg and remain on the lists, dazed and unable to rise, until attendants dragged him off. The crowd cheered regardless, caught in the spectacle rather than the tragedy. A knight's fame grew not just from victories but from surviving accidents with skill and luck. Beyond the joust itself, tournaments included melees, group combats that were less formal but equally dangerous. Knights fought in squads, clashing swords and axes in chaotic skirmishes. Aldrich found these exercises tested both skill and judgment. A poorly timed swing could strike a friend as easily as an enemy. The muddy field became a battlefield, men slipping, horses stumbling, and every moment requiring constant attention. Some fights ended with grievous injury, others with bruises and shattered helmets. Through it all, Aldrich moved with deliberate precision, using both his experience and instinct to protect himself and his allies. Yet tournaments were not only about danger, they were about glory. Winning a joust brought fame that spread far beyond the local region. Nobles offered prizes, horses, gold, even land, and the favor of patrons could change a knight's fortunes. Aldrich had learned that reputation in the lists could open doors that no quiet diligence in the castle ever could. His victories, though earned through skill, were amplified by spectacle, and he understood that a knight's fame was both a tool and a weapon. The tournaments were also deeply political. Knights often wore the livery of their lord, and each victory or defeat reflected on the house they served. A noble watching might reward or slight a knight based on his performance. Aldrich felt this weight acutely, knowing that every joust was a test not only of his prowess but of his loyalty, strategy, and composure under pressure. To falter in the lists could damage relationships, alliances, and future opportunities. Despite the pageantry, Aldrich never forgot the fine line between sport and true violence. He had seen jests escalate beyond control, with overzealous knights striking opponents after the rules had ended, or grooms and squires becoming casualties in chaotic melees. Armor could protect, but only to a point. A lance through a visor or a fall from a spirited destrier could be fatal. Aldrich respected the danger. Each match demanded focus, a clear mind, and trust in his training. In quiet moments between contests, he studied his opponents, learning their strengths, weaknesses, and tendencies. Observation became as critical as skill. Many victories were won by anticipating a strike, predicting the horse's movement, or knowing when to feint. He also refined his own techniques, adjusting his armor, experimenting with lance angles, improving his horse's responsiveness. Over time, the combination of preparation, instinct, and courage transformed him from a competent knight to a feared competitor. Yet even in triumph, the shadow of reality remained. A fallen comrade on the list reminded him that this sport, while glorious, mirrored the battlefield. The cheers of the crowd could never mask the truth that the lists demanded both bravery and ruthlessness. Aldrich carried each victory and each injury with solemnity, knowing that these contests prepared him for the harsher tests that awaited in war. By the end of the tournament season, Sir Aldrich had earned not only prizes and recognition but the hard-earned wisdom that the life of a knight was a constant balancing act. Courage with caution, skill with discipline, glory with responsibility. Every joust, every clash in the lists, was a lesson in control, endurance, and the fine line between honor and recklessness. And though the tournaments brought fame and fleeting joy, they also reminded him of the ever-present reality of bloodshed. Whether on the lists or the battlefield, a knight's life was never without risk. After months of campaigns and tournaments, Sir Aldrich returned to his lord's lands, where the work of a knight shifted from battlefield glory to the daily grind of feudal responsibility. He had learned that knighthood was as much about governance and stewardship as it was about swordplay, and the burdens of duty weighed heavily on him. The first task of a knight in peacetime was to serve his lord faithfully. This meant not only attending him in hall and council but representing his authority throughout the lands. Sir Aldrich rode from village to village, ensuring that the lord's decrees were known and that disputes were settled swiftly. He mediated arguments over property boundaries, livestock, and debts, balancing fairness with the knowledge that his lord's interests always came first. Even small decisions carried consequences. A misjudged penalty could inflame tensions, while leniency could be seen as weakness, encouraging defiance among the peasantry. Collecting taxes was among the most delicate of these duties. Sir Aldrich oversaw the gathering of rents in coin, crops, or labor, ensuring that each village contributed what was owed. Peasants often protested, claiming poor harvests or illness, and the knight had to weigh compassion against duty. He quickly learned that fairness was as essential as firmness. Too harsh, and unrest could brew; too lenient, and the lord's treasury suffered, threatening the entire manor. Each collection required patience, tact, and an understanding of human nature. Aldrich carried out his rounds with a measured approach, noting those who were struggling and reporting them to the steward for special consideration, while ensuring that no one shirked their obligations. Maintaining order among the peasants demanded constant vigilance. Banditry, petty theft, and disputes over land or livestock were common, and Aldrich had to enforce the law. Punishments ranged from fines and labor to floggings and public humiliation, depending on the severity of the offense. One memorable incident involved a small band of men who had stolen from the lord's granary during a harsh winter. Aldrich tracked them to a nearby wood, captured them, and returned them to the manor. The punishment was strict but fair. Each man labored in the fields for a season under the watchful eyes of the steward and Aldrich himself. The villagers watched, and the lesson was clear: justice was swift and impartial as expected of a knight. Even as he enforced the Lord's authority, Aldrich had to navigate the complex social hierarchy of the castle. Nobles were quick to challenge a knight who overstepped his bounds, while commoners often viewed him as a harsh enforcer. He learned to temper his actions with diplomacy, speaking with deference to lords while maintaining firmness with peasants. It was a delicate balance, and mistakes could damage his reputation or undermine the lord's authority. Every day he refined the skills of judgment and negotiation, understanding that a knight's strength was measured as much by wisdom as by sword. Feudal duty also demanded attention to military preparedness. Aldrich supervised the training of men-at-arms and squires, ensuring that the castle's defenses were ready in case of attack. He inspected weapons and armor, oversaw archery drills, and organized patrols along the borders. Even in times of peace, vigilance was essential. Raids, skirmishes, and disputes with neighboring lords could erupt suddenly, and a knight who neglected his duties could find himself, and his lord, unprepared. Beyond enforcement and defense, Aldrich also worked to maintain the infrastructure of the manor. Roads, bridges, and fortifications required constant repair. Mills and barns needed oversight, as did the storage of grain for winter. The knight learned that war might be fought with sword and shield, but peace was maintained through organization, planning, and the careful application of authority. A failure in administration could starve the people, weaken the army, and invite rebellion. Aldrich took his responsibilities seriously, knowing that his role as a knight extended far beyond combat. Life under feudal duty was also a lesson in empathy. Aldrich came to understand the struggles of peasants, the hunger, toil, and fear that shaped their daily lives. He saw children working the fields, elderly villagers bending under the weight of labor, and families surviving on the barest of rations. While he could not bend the laws entirely in their favor, he learned to act as a buffer between the harshness of the world and the Lord's authority, providing guidance, protection, and sometimes a small measure of mercy. Through all of this, Aldrich discovered that knighthood was a constant balancing act. Duty to the Lord, responsibility to the people, and the maintenance of personal honor were often at odds. One decision could satisfy one obligation while violating another. But in learning to navigate these challenges, Aldrich grew into a true knight, not merely a warrior but a man capable of judgment, leadership, and service. By the end of the season, Aldrich understood that feudal duty was a form of battle in itself. It required patience, intelligence, courage, and a steady hand. Success was measured not in bloodshed or trophies, but in the stability of the lands, the loyalty of the people, and the enduring strength of the Lord's rule. The sword might be the symbol of a knight's power, but it was his judgment, discipline, and dedication that truly defined his worth. In the quiet moments as he rode through the villages, Aldrich reflected on how far he had come from the eager boy who had first knelt as a page. Now he was a knight in full measure, tested by battle, tournaments, and the everyday trials of governance. Feudal duty had taught him that the greatest strength a knight could possess was not in his arms, but in his ability to wield authority with wisdom, justice, and honor. Even for a knight, the sword was never the only guide. Sir Aldrich quickly learned that the true measure of a man's honor was inseparable from his devotion to God. The church governed the moral and spiritual life of the medieval world, and no knight could escape its influence. For Aldrich, religion was both a comfort and a source of fear, a reminder that courage on the battlefield must be matched by courage in the soul. Daily life began and ended with prayer. Morning mass at the chapel was mandatory, attended alongside the other knights, squires, and sometimes the Lord himself. The chaplain's voice echoed across the stone walls, reading passages that spoke of sin, sacrifice, and the ultimate judgment awaiting every soul. Aldrich knelt, hands clasped, as the familiar words washed over him. In these moments he felt both the weight of his sins and the presence of a higher purpose. Even victories in tournaments or on the battlefield carried the implicit warning that pride, greed, or cruelty could condemn him if unchecked. Pilgrimages were a central part of a knight's religious duty. Once every few years, Aldrich joined a journey to a holy site, often traveling hundreds of miles on horseback, along roads beset with thieves, bandits, and rough terrain. Pilgrimages were physically demanding, exposing knights to fatigue, harsh weather, and illness, but they were believed to cleanse the soul and earn divine favor. Aldrich prepared carefully, packing supplies, coordinating with other pilgrims, and ensuring his horse was fit for the journey. Each mile he traveled reinforced the discipline he had learned through war and castle life, but it also humbled him. reminding him that earthly strength was nothing compared to the power of faith. During these pilgrimages, Aldrich encountered men and women from all walks of life: peasants, merchants, clerics, and other knights. He observed the devotion of those who prayed through hunger and fatigue, and he witnessed acts of kindness and charity that inspired him. These experiences deepened his understanding that knighthood was not only about martial prowess, but about service to God and humanity. A knight's honor was intertwined with his capacity for mercy, humility, and selflessness. Yet religious life was also marked by fear. The teachings of the Church were clear: sin could lead to eternal damnation. Aldrich often contemplated the acts he had committed in war, the killing, the pillaging, the harsh punishments he had administered in service to his Lord. While many were justified by the laws of man or necessity of combat, the weight of judgment still pressed upon him. At night, he would kneel before the altar, confessing his sins to the chaplain and seeking absolution, hoping that penance would cleanse his soul and protect him from divine wrath. Holy relics and sacred sites reinforced this constant awareness of divine authority. Visiting a cathedral, touching a relic, or witnessing a saint's shrine imbued Aldrich with a sense of awe and responsibility. He understood that each act of bravery, each exercise of power, was observed not only by his peers but by God. This awareness tempered his impulses, encouraging him to act justly even when vengeance or ambition called louder. Fasting and seasonal observances were another aspect of religious life that tested a knight's discipline. During Lent, Aldrich abstained from meat and wine, limiting himself to simple bread and water. These periods of deprivation were grueling, particularly during campaigns or tournaments, but they reinforced the virtue of self-control. He came to understand that spiritual resilience required the same dedication as martial skill, and that the body's discipline mirrored the discipline of the mind and soul. Crusades and holy wars loomed in the background of a knight's life. Though Aldrich had not yet traveled to the distant lands of the Levant, the idea of fighting for God's cause weighed heavily on his conscience. Knights were called to defend the faith, to punish heresy, and to expand Christendom. The tension between the violence required in such endeavors and the ideals of mercy and piety was something Aldrich pondered often. Each campaign, each battle, demanded careful judgment, lest zeal become cruelty and devotion turn to pride. Religious observance also shaped the ethical framework of feudal life. Decisions regarding taxation, punishment, and service were often justified through the lens of divine order. Aldrich found guidance in scripture and counsel from the chaplain, using faith to weigh justice against expediency. He realized that a knight who ignored God's laws risked more than earthly retribution. He risked eternal consequence. This fear did not paralyze him but sharpened his conscience, demanding integrity in every act, whether at court, in the village, or on the battlefield. Ultimately, religious life taught Aldrich that knighthood was more than arms and honor, it was stewardship of both body and soul. Faith infused his actions with purpose, reminding him that courage without righteousness was hollow, that loyalty without virtue was dangerous, and that every victory or punishment carried moral weight. The Church offered structure, discipline, and guidance, but also a mirror in which he constantly measured himself. Through prayer, pilgrimage, fasting, and reflection, Aldrich cultivated a sense of accountability greater than any feudal lord could impose. He carried the awareness of judgment, divine and mortal, in every swing of his sword and every decision he made. The life of a knight was brutal and demanding in body and spirit, but religion offered the path by which that brutality could be tempered by conscience, and that duty could be elevated to honor. Winter in the medieval lands was a season of trial, one that spared neither peasant nor knight. For Sir Aldrich, the cold months brought challenges far removed from the thrill of tournaments or the chaos of battle. Here, survival depended not on skill with a sword but on endurance, planning, and sheer will. The biting wind cut through mail and cloak alike, frost hardened the soil, and the scarcity of food tested every household, from the Lord's hall to the smallest village. As the first snows fell, Aldrich rode through the lands under his lord's care, inspecting fields, checking on livestock, and ensuring that peasants had adequate supplies to endure the coming months. The sight was grim. Grain stores were often low, barns creaked under the weight of snow, and weak animals struggled against the ice. The poorest villagers had barely managed to harvest enough to carry them through autumn, and winter promised hunger for those who had worked hardest yet reaped least. Aldrich helped organize rations, ensuring that children and the elderly were fed first, but he knew that even careful management could not prevent suffering entirely. Disease was as deadly as the cold. The damp, crowded interiors of village homes allowed fevers, dysentery, and pneumonia to spread quickly. Aldrich witnessed families weakened by malnutrition, huddled around meager fires to stay warm. Sentries and soldiers were also at risk. Frostbite and respiratory illness struck those on patrol or keeping watch at the castle walls. The knights spent hours coordinating care, sending for healers when available, and personally ensuring that supplies of herbs, ale, and bandages were distributed. Yet despite his efforts, death claimed many, a sobering reminder that survival was never guaranteed. Travel became perilous. Roads were icy and often blocked by snowdrifts. Horses struggled through frozen mud, and wagons carrying food or fuel could easily overturn. Aldrich led small parties along the routes between the villages and the manor, clearing paths, checking on travelers, and defending against the opportunistic bandits who thrived during harsh weather. The biting wind stung his face, and even layered furs and mail provided limited protection. Nights were particularly cruel, with temperatures dropping below freezing and no fires allowed too close to the castle walls for fear of sparks. Within the castle, duties did not lessen. Knights were expected to remain vigilant, patrolling ramparts and overseeing the garrison, even as morale dipped and supplies ran low. Training continued in modified forms, sword drills in covered yards, wrestling matches in the hall, but fatigue and cold slowed men down. Aldrich often stayed awake late into the night, ensuring the heating fires in the kitchens and barracks burned continuously and that the men had enough food and warm drink to maintain strength. Food itself became a daily struggle. Fresh meat was rare, salted or dried provisions were rationed carefully. Bread was heavy and coarse, sometimes made from a mix of barley and oats when wheat ran short. Peasants and servants grew thin and weary, and even Aldrich and his fellow knights felt the strain. The hunger was subtle at first, a gnawing in the stomach, a dull ache in the limbs, but persistent. Aldrich learned to pace himself, conserving energy for essential tasks, and to maintain discipline among those under his command to prevent panic or theft. The cold tested morale more than anything. Soldiers, squires, and peasants alike grew irritable, tempers flared easily, and minor disputes could escalate into brawls. Aldrich had to act as both judge and mediator, calming tensions, enforcing rules, and reminding everyone that survival depended on cooperation. The harsh weather stripped away pride and vanity. Survival was the only goal. Even the strongest warriors found themselves humbled by frostbite, illness, and hunger. Yet amid the hardships, Aldrich observed moments of resilience and humanity. Villagers shared their meager stores with neighbors, soldiers huddled together for warmth during night watches, and the chaplain organized prayers and vigils to strengthen faith and hope. Aldrich himself felt the limits of his strength and the necessity of relying on others. He understood that leadership was not merely about issuing orders but about ensuring the survival, health, and morale of all under his care. Winter was also a time of reflection. The long nights provided an opportunity to consider past campaigns, tournaments, and battles. Aldrich contemplated the lives lost, the decisions made, and the lessons learned. The harsh conditions reminded him of the fragility of life and the importance of preparation, foresight, and perseverance. Each hardship endured forged patience, resilience, and wisdom, the qualities of a true knight beyond the battlefield. By the time spring arrived, Aldrich and his household were exhausted but wiser. They had survived disease, hunger, and the relentless cold. The experience reinforced the reality that knighthood extended beyond combat. A knight was also a caretaker, a protector, and a steward in the harshest conditions. Those months of struggle shaped Aldrich as profoundly as any sword fight or joust, teaching him that courage was as much about endurance and responsibility as it was about bravery. In the end, winter was a teacher. It revealed human vulnerability and the limits of strength, but also the capacity for resilience, leadership, and compassion. Sir Aldrich emerged from the season tempered and alert, understanding that the life of a knight demanded constant vigilance, not only in war or sport but in the slow, quiet battle for survival when the world itself seemed against him. The life of a knight was never solely defined by swordplay or the harsh rhythms of war and winter. It was also defined by the delicate, perilous web of politics that surrounded the noble courts and manors. For Sir Aldrich, the world of alliances, betrayals, and shifting loyalties was as treacherous as any battlefield, requiring cunning, judgment, and restraint. It began subtly. A neighboring baron sent emissaries bearing gifts and messages of friendship, praising the Lord Aldrich served while hinting at mutual benefits should the alliance be strengthened. At first, these were minor courtesies, fine wines, bolts of cloth, and letters sealed with the baron's insignia. But Aldrich sensed that each gesture carried layered meaning, expectations, obligations, and veiled threats that might draw his lord into decisions favoring another's ambition. Within his own court, tension simmered. Some knights whispered that certain advisors were plotting to undermine the lord's authority. Others pressed for favors, lands, or positions, subtly leveraging loyalty for personal gain. Aldrich observed the interplay with cautious eyes, aware that one misstep, an ill-considered word, an open accusation, or a public show of partiality, could ignite conflict. The code of chivalry demanded honor, but politics demanded strategy, subtlety, and discretion. The two were often in conflict. Betrayal, Aldrich learned, could come from the most unexpected quarters. A trusted squire of another knight was caught conveying sensitive information to a rival lord, and the incident sent shockwaves through the court. Aldrich helped mediate the response, balancing the need for justice with the desire to maintain stability. The squire was punished, but the underlying tensions remained, illustrating that loyalty was fragile and the consequences of treachery extended far beyond the individual. Alliances were equally dangerous. Aldrich witnessed the careful negotiations of marriage, land exchange, and military support. Promises were made with calculated ambiguity, and loyalty was often conditional, tied to circumstance rather than principle. A knight could swear to defend a lord one season, only to shift allegiance the next if another power offered greater reward. Aldrich realized that in politics, as in war, timing and perception were critical. One careless comment or misinterpreted action could be exploited to devastating effect. The subtle art of diplomacy became a daily lesson. Aldrich attended councils where words were chosen with precision, where courtiers masked ambition with courtesy, and where silence could be as powerful as speech. He learned to read expressions, to discern meaning behind flattery, and to sense the ambitions of those who smiled too widely. Decisions had to balance honor, practicality, and survival. A knight who upheld loyalty blindly risked exploitation. One who acted solely out of self-interest risked dishonor and isolation. Pressure mounted further when external threats intertwined with internal tensions. Rumors circulated that a neighboring lord sought to destabilize the region by bribing minor officials and fomenting rebellion among the peasants. Aldrich was tasked with investigating, negotiating, and reporting back to his lord without exposing the investigation to potential spies. Each move required prudence and discretion. Failure could mean betrayal of the lord, bloodshed, or both. At times, Aldrich confronted moral dilemmas that had no clear resolution. Should he expose a fellow knight secretly colluding with a rival baron, knowing it might fracture alliances and weaken the lord's position? Could he allow certain compromises, even when they violated the strictest interpretation of chivalric duty, to prevent greater harm? Each choice weighed heavily on him, demonstrating that political skill was inseparable from ethical judgment. A knight was not only a warrior but also a strategist of loyalty, a judge of character, and a mediator of ambition. The stakes were personal as well. Aldrich noticed that friendships were fragile, tested by ambition, envy, and circumstance. Allies one day could become rivals the next. Favors granted could be held over one's head as leverage. He learned to cultivate careful relationships, to reward loyalty discreetly, and to act with measured caution when navigating disputes. Honor had to coexist with prudence and courage with subtlety. Even the lord he served was not immune to political pressure. Aldrich observed the delicate dance of decisions, how promises to one ally might offend another, how counsels could be swayed by flattery or threats, and how the slightest misjudgment could destabilize the region. A knight's role in this environment was both supportive and protective, to counsel wisely, enforce decisions with authority, and sometimes act as a discreet enforcer when subtlety alone would not suffice. Through these trials, Aldrich understood that loyalty was a double-edged sword. Blind loyalty could be exploited, conditional loyalty could be questioned. A knight had to navigate the interplay of honor, duty, and self-preservation, always aware that betrayal could come from within or without. Political skill was not less important than martial skill. Indeed, one sword could protect a lord only as long as wisdom and strategy guided it. By the season's end, Sir Aldrich emerged wiser and more cautious. He had witnessed deception, navigated alliances, and maintained his own honor amid shifting loyalties. Political intrigue, he realized, was an invisible battlefield, one where words and perception wielded as much power as swords and armor. A knight who survived such battles without losing his integrity had mastered a rare and essential skill, one that would serve him as much in the hall as on the battlefield. In the end, Aldrich recognized that politics, like winter or war, was an enduring test of the knight's character. Courage alone was insufficient. Discipline, judgment, observation, and a keen understanding of human nature were required. A knight's life was never free of danger. Sometimes that danger came not from arrows or lances, but from whispers, secrets, and the treacherous paths of loyalty in a world where honor and ambition were forever intertwined. For all the steel, discipline, and bloodshed that defined a knight's life, Sir Aldric discovered that matters of the heart were equally demanding and far less predictable. Love, marriage, and the pursuit of heirs were bound up in both duty and desire, and a knight had to navigate the delicate intersection of personal longing, social expectation, and political advantage. Courtly love was one of the first lessons Aldric learned as a young knight. He had admired the lady of the castle from afar, as minstrels sang of knights who performed noble deeds to win the favor of a lady's glance or smile. The rituals of courtly love, gifts, poetry, public gestures of devotion, were intended to elevate romance into an art, a form of moral refinement. Aldric participated cautiously, offering tokens of admiration and small favors, yet he quickly realized that the performance of love was complicated. It was a dance of respect, patience, and subtlety, one where misstep could offend a lady or scandalize the court. Yet admiration alone was not enough to satisfy the demands of knighthood. Marriage was both a personal and political matter, a tool for securing alliances, inheritance, and social stability. Aldric's lord arranged a union with a noble woman from a neighboring estate, as was customary. The marriage was less about passion and more about consolidating influence. Aldric approached it with respect and diligence, understanding that his duties as a husband were intertwined with his responsibilities as a knight, to protect, provide, and uphold honor. Living together, Aldric and his wife discovered that marriage required negotiation, patience, and understanding. The shared responsibilities of managing estates, attending court functions, and raising heirs demanded attention and cooperation. Love, if it developed, was built gradually through respect, shared burdens, and the rare moments of private tenderness amid a life of obligation. Aldric learned that romantic gestures were fleeting compared to the constant work of building trust, maintaining decorum, and sustaining family alliances. Heirs became a central focus of Aldric's domestic life. Sons were expected to continue the lineage, inherit lands, and uphold the family's honor. Daughters were valuable in forging alliances through marriage. Each child's birth brought both joy and anxiety. Aldric worried over their health, education, and future prospects, knowing that the success of his family depended not only on his valor but also on prudent guidance. Even in times of war or political tension, the welfare of his children occupied a significant part of his thoughts. Heartbreak was never far, however. The risks of childbirth, illness, and the harsh realities of life meant that loss was constant. Aldric witnessed the death of infants, the suffering of his wife in labor, and the sorrow of neighbors whose children never survived the first winter. Emotional resilience became as crucial as martial skill. A knight could not afford to be paralyzed by grief, yet he had to honor it and allow the memory of lost loved ones to temper his decisions and deepen his compassion. Courtly love, too, continued to exist in subtle forms. Admiration from others, flirtations, or the occasional infatuation tested Aldric's loyalty. He learned to balance natural human desire with the obligations of fidelity and honor, understanding that indiscretion could endanger alliances, reputation, and the well-being of his family. The line between polite affection and scandal was razor-thin, and a knight's reputation was fragile. Aldric grew cautious, exercising discretion while maintaining civility in all interactions. Marriage also revealed the ways in which love and duty could conflict. Aldric found that political considerations sometimes clashed with personal preference. Negotiations over dowries, estates, and alliances required compromise and restraint. At times, he had to set aside affection for the sake of his lord's interests or the security of his family. Each decision carried consequences. Displeasing a powerful ally could weaken the family's position, yet failing to act in accordance with his conscience risked internal strife and personal regret. Despite the challenges, Aldric discovered that love and marriage offered a grounding influence amid the chaos of campaigns, tournaments, and political intrigue. The quiet moments with his wife, watching their children grow, managing the household, and sharing private conversation, reminded him of life beyond the sword. These moments provided perspective, teaching him patience, empathy, and the capacity to nurture, qualities that strengthened him both as a husband and as a knight. Over time, Aldric came to understand that love was not simply a fleeting passion but a sustained effort, a continuous choice to act with honor, respect, and care. Marriage demanded the same discipline as any battlefield. Courtly love provided inspiration, arranged marriage ensured stability, and raising heirs ensured continuity of honor and duty. Heartbreak and loss, while painful, offered lessons in resilience, compassion, and the depth of human experience. By the twilight of his life, Aldrich reflected that the life of a knight was incomplete without love and family. The sword, the armor, the campaigns, they defined public honor. But the private bonds of marriage, the devotion to heirs, and the practice of love, even within the constraints of duty, defined personal honor. A knight who could balance both spheres, who could fight bravely and love faithfully, was truly whole. In the end, Sir Aldrich learned that matters of the heart were as perilous, demanding, and rewarding as any battlefield. Courtly gestures, strategic marriages, care for heirs, and the endurance of heartbreak were tests of character, patience, and virtue. The sword could win battles, but love and marriage shaped the soul, leaving a legacy that would endure long after campaigns ended and armor rusted in the hall. For a knight, a reputation could be a sword as sharp as any forged in the smithy, cutting paths to glory or leaving deep wounds of shame. Sir Aldrich learned early that every action, every word, and every choice could be judged by allies, rivals, lords, and the common people alike. Honor was both fragile and invaluable. It was the invisible currency by which a knight's life, legacy, and influence were measured. Duels were among the most visible tests of reputation. They could arise from personal grievances, disputes over honor, or challenges from rival knights seeking to assert dominance. Aldrich knew that to refuse a challenge was to invite suspicion, ridicule, and loss of standing. To accept recklessly was to risk life and limb. The careful balance between courage and prudence was a skill honed over years. Each duel required preparation, not only physical but mental, anticipating an opponent's skill, strategy, and temperament. A knight who faltered in a duel risked not just injury but irreparable damage to his honor. Beyond formal duels, reputation was tested constantly in courts, tournaments, and social gatherings. A careless word, a perceived slight, or even failure to act decisively could be twisted into scandal. Aldrich became attuned to the subtleties of social perception. He learned that maintaining respect among peers demanded vigilance, self-discipline, and an understanding of human psychology. A knight's reputation was a reflection not just of deeds but of character as perceived by others, a delicate balance of truth, perception, and performance. Failure in battle carried similar consequences. Even the most skilled and courageous knight could find himself accused of cowardice if circumstances turned against him. Aldrich had witnessed peers fall from favor after losing a skirmish, regardless of the bravery they displayed. He understood that to maintain reputation required not only skill but strategy, knowing when to fight, when to retreat, and how to report outcomes in ways that preserved honor. Reputation was shaped as much by storytelling as by action, and a knight's allies and enemies alike could amplify or diminish deeds according to their own interests. Public service, too, tested reputation. As a mediator of disputes, enforcer of law, or collector of taxes, Aldrich knew that fairness, firmness, and prudence were essential. Missteps could brand a knight as cruel, weak, or corrupt, while judicious action could enhance respect and trust. The eyes of peasants, lords, and fellow knights alike were constantly evaluating his conduct. Reputation demanded consistency. One lapse could undo years of service and achievement. Rivalry among knights added another layer of pressure. Competition for favor, land, or prestige often turned friendships into contests of skill, cunning, and influence. Aldrich learned to manage these rivalries carefully. Publicly, he upheld courtesy and chivalry, acknowledging the skill of others. Privately, he studied rivals, preparing for challenges, whether in tournaments, duels, or campaigns. Every victory reinforced his standing. Every misstep was scrutinized, magnified, and remembered. Honor was also inseparable from morality. Knights who acted with cruelty, deceit, or selfish ambition risked more than social disgrace. They risked spiritual condemnation and loss of trust. Aldrich's faith guided him in these matters. He knew that maintaining a strong reputation required balancing ambition with virtue, courage with compassion, and loyalty with wisdom. To be feared without respect was hollow. To be respected without principle was fragile. Even the weight of failure could shape a knight's life. Aldrich had known moments when circumstances beyond his control led to setbacks, whether a lost battle, an unsuccessful negotiation, or a mishandled dispute. In each case, the judgment of peers and lords weighed heavily. Redemption required courage, skill, and sometimes public acts of contrition or renewed service. A reputation, once tarnished, could be restored, but only through deliberate action and the demonstration of consistent honor over time. Conversely, success and courage elevated reputation swiftly. A single heroic act, saving a comrade, leading a decisive charge, or achieving a remarkable victory in a tournament, could enhance standing across the region. Aldrich understood that reputation was cumulative but also volatile. He guarded his words and actions, aware that every decision contributed to a larger narrative that would define him long after specific deeds were forgotten. In quiet reflection, Aldrich recognized that reputation was more than public perception. It was a measure of legacy. The respect of peers, the admiration of the Lord, the trust of the people, and the judgment of God all intertwined to create a complex tapestry that a knight carried throughout life. Reputation shaped alliances, influenced marriage prospects, and determined the impact a knight could have on the world. By the end of this stage in his life, Sir Aldrich understood that a knight's sword alone could not define him. Reputation was earned through courage, wisdom, morality, and restraint. It was tested in battle, tournaments, duels, and the subtle maneuverings of court and community. A knight who failed to uphold honor risked not only personal disgrace but also the weakening of the structures he was sworn to protect. Reputation, Aldrich realized, was both shield and weapon, a legacy more enduring than any victory in war and more influential than any prize won in tournament lists. Even the mightiest knights could not escape the passage of time. Sir Aldrich, now seasoned with decades of campaigns, tournaments, and feudal service, felt the slow but inexorable weight of age pressing against him. Yet duty called once more. A neighboring baron had rebelled, threatening the stability of his lord's domain, and Sir Aldrich, despite the stiffness in his joints and the fatigue that lingered after even short rides, was summoned to lead men into battle one final time. Preparation for the campaign was meticulous. Aldrich inspected his armor carefully, noting worn straps and dents from decades of combat. His horse, though strong and well-trained, no longer matched the speed and vigor of its younger counterparts. He trained steadily, practicing strikes and maneuvers with a careful awareness of his body's limitations. Every step, every swing required precision rather than brute strength. Mistakes now carried heavier consequences than they ever had. The march toward the rebellious lands was grueling. Frost lingered in early spring mornings, and uneven terrain tested both horse and rider. Squires and younger men looked to Aldrich for leadership, relying on his experience to guide them through the logistical and moral complexities of war. He gave counsel, steadied nerves, and maintained discipline, drawing on decades of hard-earned wisdom. The burdens were both physical and emotional. Each injury, each casualty, weighed more heavily now as he recognized that he could not fight with the same reckless abandon of youth. When battle finally erupted, Aldrich faced both the ferocity of the enemy and the limitations of his aging body. His reflexes were slower, his endurance shorter, but his mind remained sharp. He led from the front, relying on strategy, positioning, and the coordination of his men rather than the brute force that had carried him in earlier years. Each clash of steel echoed louder in his ears, each shout and cry of pain more poignant. He recognized the fragility of life for himself and those he commanded, with a clarity that only age could bring. The brutality of the campaign reminded Aldrich that war's essence never changed, even as the warrior aged. Disease, hunger, and exhaustion took their toll on the army. He tended personally to the wounded, offering comfort and guidance while maintaining order. Every day presented the harsh realities he had faced before, yet now compounded by the knowledge that his own time was finite. Mortality, once an abstract shadow, loomed closer, and each decision carried the weight of potential finality. Leadership became more cerebral than physical. Aldrich relied on careful planning, ambushes, and strategic retreats to conserve strength and preserve lives. His experience allowed him to anticipate enemy movements, exploit weaknesses, and minimize unnecessary bloodshed. Younger knights executed his commands with precision, trusting his judgment even when they outmatched him in speed or stamina. Aldrich discovered that the value of a knight did not diminish with age. It transformed into wisdom, foresight, and the ability to inspire others. Amid the chaos, moments of reflection surfaced. Aldrich thought of the countless campaigns, tournaments, and feudal duties he had endured. He remembered comrades lost to arrows, disease, or the unforgiving cold of winter. He reflected on rivals bested in duels or on the lists. He pondered the weight of his own reputation and the legacy he would leave behind. Each memory fueled his resolve, reminding him why honor, duty, and loyalty mattered even more as his years advanced. The final battle was both fierce and swift. Aldrich's men held firm, executing maneuvers he had taught them through years of mentorship. Arrows rained down, swords clashed, and the cries of combat echoed across the fields. Aldrich fought with skill and cunning, delivering decisive blows when necessary and directing others where strength faltered. Yet he felt every strain, every ache, and every bruise more deeply than ever before. The realization that victory might be his last heightened his focus, compelling him to act with calm determination amid chaos. As the enemy forces broke and fled, Aldrich stood surveying the aftermath. The ground was scarred, littered with broken weapons, fallen horses and wounded men. Relief was tempered with sorrow, survival always carried loss, and each life claimed weighed heavily on his conscience. He recognized that the glory of victory was fleeting while the cost, the pain, the memory, the exhaustion, was enduring. Returning to his lord's lands, Aldrich knew that this campaign marked the final chapter of his active military life. His body, though battered and tired, remained a testament to resilience and dedication. His mind, sharpened by decades of strategy, leadership and moral reflection, was his most enduring weapon. He had faced countless battles, survived tournaments, navigated political intrigue, fulfilled feudal duty, and endured winters that would have broken lesser men. Now, as he walked among his men, he felt the slow pull of the years, the shadow of mortality ever present, and the satisfaction of a life fully lived. Sir Aldrich's final campaign taught him that a knight's true strength lay not in muscle alone, but in the wisdom, courage and integrity carried through decades of trial. Even as the shadow of death loomed, he faced it with honor, knowing that his legacy, his deeds, his mentorship, his loyalty and his guidance, would endure beyond his own years. The final battle was not just for land or lord, but a testament to a life lived with unwavering dedication, a last stand that honored the principles he had upheld since his earliest days as a page. Every knight, no matter how valiant, faces a day when the sword must be laid down forever. For Sir Aldrich, that day came quietly, yet with the gravity befitting a lifetime of service, battle, and honor. Years of campaigns, tournaments, and feudal duties had left their mark upon him. Aches, wounds that never fully healed, and the fatigue of decades of hard living. But it was neither battlefield injury nor a foe's blade that finally claimed him. Rather, it was the slow encroachment of illness, a reminder that even the strongest steel eventually succumbs to time. In his final days, Aldrich was surrounded by those he had mentored, served with, and protected. Squires and younger knights kept vigil, ensuring that he lacked nothing, while his family attended to his comfort. The air in his chamber was heavy with the scent of herbs and incense, and the soft murmur of prayers rose from the chapel beyond the castle walls. Aldrich, once so vigorous and commanding, now lay in bed, reflecting upon the decades of his life, the triumphs, the failures, the loves and the losses that had shaped him. The rituals of a knight's passing were solemn and precise. The chaplain came daily, offering prayers for absolution and peace. Aldrich received the sacrament, confessing sins and seeking the mercy of God. Even in weakness, he understood that a knight's honor extended to the manner of his death. Acceptance, courage and dignity were expected until the last breath, and Aldrich met these final requirements with the same steadfastness that had carried him through countless battles. Family and retainers gathered around him, sharing stories of his deeds, recounting victories on the battlefield and in tournaments, and recalling the lessons he had imparted. Laughter mingled with tears as tales of bravery, cleverness, and occasional mischief reminded all present that Aldrich's life had been as full as it had been challenging. He listened, offering a faint smile, aware that these remembrances were not only consolation for those he left behind but a preservation of his legacy. His body weakened further with each passing day, yet his mind remained sharp. He gave instructions regarding the inheritance of lands, the guidance of his heirs, and the continued mentorship of younger knights. He emphasized the importance of honor, courage, and loyalty, ensuring that the principles he had lived by would persist even after his passing. The weight of death, though present, did not diminish his concern for duty. It sharpened it, focusing his thoughts on the enduring impact of his life. When the final moment arrived, it was peaceful. Aldrich lay in bed, surrounded by his family and closest companions, the chaplain reciting prayers for the soul, and the soft light of candles illuminating the chamber. He spoke few words, offering a blessing to those present and expressing gratitude for the years he had lived. Then, with a calm breath, Sir Aldrich passed, leaving behind the mortal world he had known and the legacy he had forged through decades of service, courage, and integrity. The funeral rituals were carried out with solemn respect and strict adherence to tradition. His body was washed and anointed, dressed in ceremonial garb that reflected his rank and achievements. A knight's sword and shield were placed beside him, symbols of the martial life he had led and the honor he had upheld. The coffin was carried through the castle gates, accompanied by mourners from all walks of life, noble allies, fellow knights, retainers and villagers alike, each paying homage to the man who had shaped their lives through protection, leadership, and example. The procession to the burial site was deliberate and reverent. Bells tolled from the chapel tower, marking the passage from life to death. The chaplain led prayers, invoking God's mercy and the hope of eternal peace. Along the route, those gathered reflected upon Aldrich's deeds, his victories, his mentorship, his steadfast service to his Lord and people. For many, the funeral was not only a mourning of loss but a celebration of a life fully realized, a life that had embodied the ideals of knighthood. At the grave, Aldrich's body was lowered with careful hands, the sword and shield remaining as a testament to his martial legacy. Stones were placed, prayers offered, and finally the earth covered him, closing the chapter of his physical existence. Yet the lessons, the honor, and the reputation he had cultivated continued to influence those who remained. Young knights who had trained under his guidance would carry his techniques, principles, and sense of duty into the next generation. The stories of his campaigns, tournaments, and acts of wisdom would be told and retold, ensuring that Sir Aldrich's life resonated long after the final shovelful of soil had been placed. In death, as in life, Sir Aldrich's essence was a fusion of courage, honor, and legacy. He had faced battles, political intrigue, winters of hardship, moral dilemmas, and the trials of love and family with integrity and determination. The passing of a knight was not merely the extinguishing of a life, it was the final affirmation of a code, a tradition, and a way of being that shaped all who had known him and all who would hear his story. The shadow of death, once looming and feared, became a reminder of what truly mattered: honor, loyalty, courage, and the impact one leaves upon the world. Sir Aldrich's sword was now silent, but the life it had defended and the values it had upheld would endure in memory, in story, and in the deeds of those who followed. In this way, the death of a knight was never an end, but the lasting continuation of a legacy forged through a life lived with unwavering commitment to the ideals of knighthood. The life of a knight does not end with the final breath. It continues in memory, in deeds inspired by that life, and in the stories passed from one generation to the next. Sir Aldrich, whose years had been marked by battles, tournaments, feudal duty, religious devotion, and the trials of love, left behind a legacy that shaped not only his family but the communities and knights who had known him. His story became legend, a standard against which courage, honor, and duty were measured. Within his family, Aldrich's influence endured most directly. His children, raised with both guidance and example, carried forward the lessons he had imparted. Sons trained to wield sword and lance with skill, but also to govern lands with fairness and prudence. Daughters were taught the importance of diplomacy, loyalty, and the careful exercise of influence in a world that demanded both subtlety and resolve. Family gatherings were imbued with stories of his exploits, of battles won against impossible odds, of wisdom applied in tense council chambers, and of acts of mercy and justice that had earned him the admiration of both nobles and peasants. Through them, his values persisted, shaping future generations who bore his name and continued his lineage. Among the peasants, Aldrich's legacy was no less profound. The villagers remembered a knight who, though commanding and disciplined, had shown fairness, protection, and occasional mercy in their daily lives. They recalled winters when he ensured that no family went entirely without food, summers when he mediated disputes without cruelty, and moments when his guidance preserved lives and livelihoods. In folk tales, his deeds took on an almost mythic quality: the knight who defended the weak, guided the lost, and enforced justice with both firmness and compassion. To the common people, his name became synonymous with honor tempered by humanity, a rare combination that bridged the gap between nobility and the lives of ordinary folk. Among knights and warriors, Aldrich's reputation became a benchmark. His strategies and campaigns were studied, his approach to duels and tournaments emulated, and his understanding of feudal duty and political intrigue discussed with admiration. Younger knights who had trained under him carried forward not only his techniques but also his ethical code, demonstrating that true valor required more than skill with weapons. It demanded judgment, patience, and moral integrity. Aldrich's story was recounted at courts, during training, and even in the quiet moments before battle, serving as both inspiration and a guide for those striving to meet the ideals of knighthood. Even beyond the lands he governed or the people he protected, Aldrich's life became the subject of chroniclers and storytellers. Songs, poems, and manuscripts recounted his campaigns, his moral dilemmas, and his personal virtues. These accounts, though sometimes embellished, preserved the essence of a life devoted to courage, honor, and service. The tales reminded audiences of the multifaceted nature of knighthood, a balance of physical prowess, wisdom, faith, diplomacy, and compassion. In this way, Aldrich transcended his mortal years, entering the realm of legend, where the lessons of his life could reach far beyond those who had known him personally. Legacy, Aldrich realized before his death, was not built solely on victories or accolades but on the impact of one's choices, actions, and guidance. The fields he had defended, the villages he had protected, and the men he had trained carried forward the values he had embodied. Even in death, his influence persisted in the institutions he strengthened, the alliances he forged, and the ethical principles he modeled. A knight's legacy was, in essence, the echo of integrity reverberating through time, shaping both human hearts and the moral framework of society. Over the decades, Aldric's legend became interwoven with the cultural memory of the region. Festivals, local tales, and commemorative rituals honored his life, blending historical fact with symbolic representation. Children learned of the knight who embodied justice and courage, and adults reflected on the balance he had maintained between strength and mercy, duty and compassion. His story served as both moral instruction and entertainment, illustrating that the virtues of a knight extended beyond the battlefield into every aspect of life. In the final analysis, Sir Aldric's life demonstrated that a knight's true immortality lay not in fame or trophies, but in the enduring influence on those who came after. His children, peers, protégés, and even the peasantry became vessels through which his values and lessons continued to shape the world. Battles ended, wars concluded, and years passed, yet the ideals he embodied, courage, honor, loyalty, compassion, and wisdom, remained alive, guiding actions and inspiring emulation. Thus, the story of Sir Aldric is not merely the recounting of campaigns, tournaments, or feudal duties. It is the portrait of a life fully lived, where martial skill, moral judgment, and personal virtue converge to create a lasting impact. History remembers him not simply as a man who wielded a sword, but as a figure whose life illuminated the path of knighthood for generations to come. His legacy, rooted in both reality and legend, ensured that the values he fought for, protected, and embodied would endure long after his body returned to the earth. In this way, the life of Sir Aldric transcended mortality. The knight who had faced war, winter, disease, political intrigue, and the trials of love left behind more than memory. He left an enduring example of what it meant to live with honor. His story, recounted by family, celebrated by peasants, and studied by knights, became a testament to the enduring power of virtue, courage, and the human capacity to leave the world better than one found it. A knight's legend, Aldric's legend, was never truly confined to the grave. It lived on in every act of honor inspired by his life.